Okay, I'm with Pamela Crawford here at the Northwest Regional Library on May 28th, 2005 to give a speech on her book. Pamela, thank you for being with me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, I'm going to start out just by giving people an idea. In your book here, this is a fantastic book. It's got a lot of illustrations, pictures, everything that you need to know about preparing your plants and shrubs, trees for hurricane conditions. You know, on page 34 and 35 of your book, we get into the palm tree subject. Now, palm trees are many people's favorite trees for the state of Florida. Which trees really, in your opinion, as far as palm trees, are the safest to plant in your yard if you're in a hurricane zone like Florida?
The number one tree for staying up in hurricanes is the Pygmy date palm, which is a small palm tree, and it only gets to be about 10 feet tall.
Right.
One that's taller, that's also excellent, is the sable palm, which is also the state tree of Florida.
Now, I have a queen palm myself. Hurricane Jean took that thing down, and there's two left that are remaining standing. Queen palms, you do not recommend planting queen palms. Perfect proof of that with it almost falling on the house. What do you recommend for somebody that has a tree that they're not sure about? They're scared. They read your book and they realize this is not a good tree to have here. What would you recommend people do with trees and plants that they know are not ready for a hurricane?
I think it's a value judgment that each person has to make. I would say if you have a tree that we know falls in very low winds, particularly 60 to 80 mile an hour winds, which the experts say we have a 100% chance of getting in the next 15 years, and you know that tree can do significant damage, you need to take it out. I'm talking in South Florida, particularly about ficus trees, about laurel oaks, and about Australian pines. If you have the trees trimmed, if it's a ficus or laurel oak, that will help, but it still won't actually keep it up if the winds get to be high enough. And the reason that I'm really on those particular trees is that we know that those can destroy your house. And you don't want to have a tree destroy the house because that's going to cost you an awful lot more.
Now, you did mention the ficus trees, and there's a lot of those around in South Florida. They are not very wind resistant from reading your book. They go down, especially if they're not trimmed, they're going to go down. My question is, I know that from past hurricanes that when it rains a lot, if it's a wet hurricane, a lot of the trees go over easier than if it's a dry type of a hurricane, more like a windstorm. What would you say to people? Is it okay watering stuff? Would you say to people not to water plants and trees before a hurricane's coming so that the ground stays a little drier maybe so that the trees don't tip over? Have you found any proof of that, or is there any does watering matter around a time of a hurricane is coming?
Not landscape irrigation, because the average sprinkler system stays on for approximately 30 minutes. You only want to give half an inch of water each time you water. Therefore, that's not really going to affect it or not. Where you see trees actually floating out of the ground, I believe we had, 32 inches of rain last September? When you get in numbers like 5 inches, 10 inches, 15 inches, then you've got a problem.
Now, we're looking at a picture of a Laurel Oak Tree. A lot of these went down during the hurricane, too. Not to say that you could stake this kind of a tree, but is it a good idea to try to stake a tree when you know a hurricane is coming, maybe to salvage it or stop it from tipping over sooner than if it was not staked at all?
In certain situations, yes. If you have a tree that's newly planted, most of the time, particularly if you're getting one from a tree farm, it's been transplanted there, the tree company who installs it is going to put a very good staking system around it because the roots are not established yet, and it's not a stable thing. A lot of those staking systems did keep the trees upright. It's also very smart to keep small trees that fall easily. For example, hibiscus trees, bougainvillea trees, or cassia trees permanently staked, which I have done at my house. And it did hold them up during Jean, whereas they had all come down at Francis. Now, where it gets tricky is on the really large trees. People are now developing staking systems for things like laurel oaks. Well, we don't know. If we stake it, say, 10 feet from the ground down, and you have a tree that's 60 feet tall, at the top of it's not just going to snap off. So that is left to be seen because a lot of people are working on all kinds of inventions of that type.
Okay, this next picture is of Australian pines. Now, a lot of these went down during Hurricane Charlie. You mentioned during your speech about how much it cost each person in that area that was affected by Charlie for each Australian pine that went down. Can you elaborate a little on it?
Yes, if you look at Sanibel and Captiva, 60% of the debris that was taken out of Sanibel and Captiva as a result of the winds of Charlie was one particular tree species, which is Australian pine. It ended up costing $553 per resident of those two islands simply to have that debris hauled away and burned, to say nothing of the buildings it took down, as well as the cost with each property owner of actually getting it chopped up and taken to the street.
That's unbelievable. Now, you mentioned a tree that fell over in your yard, that you took all the tall trees away from your house, and one of them tipped over that you were going to cut, but you decided not to cut it, and it cost you a lot more money to haul it out because the root system was exposed. And to cut the root, I guess to haul that away is a large amount of money. So if anybody has any doubt, would you recommend they maybe just cut it down before hurricane season instead of taking the chance and having to pay for having the whole tree removed?
Once again, let's go by species, because I do have some tall trees. I left the slash pines around my house, but I took the Australian pines out around the house. But further out from that, I thought it would be cheaper for me to go ahead and wait for the thing to fall down and then simply have it chopped up and taken to the curb. What I did not realize were two things. Number one, when it came down, there was such a huge mass from this 10-foot-tall root ball that it ended up costing $3,500 to get all that taken away, plus the collateral damage that tree took down 14 other native trees, causing several of them to snap very near houses. So an Australian that was actually far enough away not to fall on the house almost took one out anyway. Australian pines used to be just in South Florida because essentially they're not freeze tolerant. But with global warming and with our freeze line moving further north every year, the trees are moving with that. And I was really astounded to see them as far north as St. Petersburg.
Wow.
When I was over there recently. They're also very rapidly going into St. Lucie County and further north. So whereas in South Florida we may be fairly familiar with them as being a pest tree, it's really, really important that people a little bit further north also know to get this one out.
Well, you asked me that question about the reach of the website, and people listen to these clips from all over the Atlantic Basin, not just from Florida. So are a lot of these trees in this book, I know this is primarily for Florida residents, but could somebody outside of the state have an interest in a lot of the trees that are in this book? Are they represented in other states?
Yes, particularly because when you get into climate zone 8, which is the Panhandle, we have a lot of trees there that also grow throughout the Gulf Coast region, all the way from Texas through Louisiana through Mississippi in areas that are very hard hit, and also up in South Carolina coast around the Charleston area as well.
Now, we focused here on tropical plants in South Florida. What about areas north, like in the Panhandle? How did the foliage and the trees grow up in that area?
The worst trees in the Panhandle were native trees, which surprised us because in South Florida the natives did better than the exotics. But in the Panhandle, and this would also spread into Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas coast, and the coast of South Carolina, the laurel oak was the absolute worst tree. Also, the water oaks did very badly. And also some of the pine species snapped. Not so much the traditional slash pine, but some of the pines that are closer to the beach areas.
Pamela, have you ever seen a heavily damaged home that had a lot of trees around it? I know that they say, well, it's good to kind of plant trees around your home because it acts as a wind screen or a shield. Have you seen cases where even despite the trees there's been some heavy damage to the house?
Of course, particularly when you get near the eye of the storm, because you have different kinds of damage happening. Some of it is damage that happens purely from wind, and if you get 150-mile-an-hour winds going through there, it really doesn't matter whether you have trees around them or not. The whole thing is going to go, the trees and the house. But when you have lower winds, the trees around the house can make a lot of difference. They can either ruin you or make your life a lot easier at that point, because if you have trees that are over 40 feet tall that fall easily, you can actually lose your house in winds as low as 60 to 80 miles an hour. If you have very strong trees around your house, then it could actually save your house, particularly in that under 100-mile-an-hour wind range.
You mentioned in your speech that hedges are not necessarily as good as planting a tall palm tree and a short palm tree and then another tall palm tree and a short palm tree kind of around your property. What can happen to a hedge, or what are the drawbacks to hedges?
They're too thick, and their wind has nowhere to go through them. If you notice, most of the trees that are really strong in wind, you think of a live oak for a minute, that you can see through that canopy, that the wind can actually go through the canopy. If it's hitting something very, very thick, it has a lot more tendency to knock it over rather than going through it. If you have a wall of palm trees, then there's going to be all kinds of little spots through those palm trees where that wind can flow pretty freely, but it's not going to have anywhere near the intensity on one side that it does on the other.
Overall, you don't work with just trees, but with plants as well and gardens. And gardens, I would think myself that, especially in a major hurricane, if you have a garden outside, it's pretty much going to be wiped out from a hurricane, a significant hurricane. Overall, people expect their gardens to survive a hurricane, or do you think that they can expect the worst?
It depends on the force of the winds, and it depends on your tree cover. It was really interesting because I toured a lot of gardens after these hurricanes, and the ones that had strong trees over them, the trees actually protected the garden. A garden at my house particularly, because we had a lot of gardens that were out in the open, and the winds just went through them and devastated them. We had other gardens with very weak trees in them. They were completely wiped out. But we had one garden that was very well protected. It was surrounded by a double to triple layer of palm trees, and it was literally untouched.
Well, what about what you put on the ground, like mulch or rocks and things like that? What would you recommend for a garden as the best thing to put on the ground around your bushes?
We use organic mulch most of the time. Things like pine straw work quite well. The winds are measured 30 feet in the air. So as you get closer and closer to the ground, the winds go down. It was interesting. I had a lot of reports on what animals did, wild animals did during this last hurricane. And a lot of them get out in an open area and flatten themselves down to the ground. And provided nothing hits them from above, they're going to be pretty safe. Same thing with your garden. Right on the ground is where we have the least amount of damage.
Pamela, I've noticed that many trees have a V-cut. In other words, you're looking at the power lines and you see the tree shaped like the letter V. They trim the tree branches away from the power lines. Is this proved to be successful for not knocking the power lines down? And isn't this kind of an unnatural state for trees to be in?
It is unnatural. The people from the power companies that trim the trees are very, very smart. All of the power companies have arborists working for them. They have a lot to deal with the trees around the power lines. There are an awful lot of people who have those trees actually shading their yards and don't want the whole tree taken out. And the V-cut's been something that's very well studied. If the tree is weak to begin with, let's say if it's a laurel oak, if it's a water oak, then obviously it's not a good thing to do, but I think they're doing the best they can given the situation. Most places don't have ordinances which say that you can't plant these giant trees around power lines, so they're doing the best they can.
So it's been a help then. In other words, keeping the power lines from going down, it's been successful?
No, that's not the point. The point of putting the V-cut is to keep the power lines from touching the trees, because of the fact that if they were to spark or something, it could actually catch the tree on fire. It really doesn't have anything to do with trying to keep it from coming down in wind.
You mentioned in your book about trees that can be salvaged after they get knocked over. I know a lot of trees are too heavy for most people to get out there and pull them back up by themselves or with a neighbor. So what would you say to people to preserve the tree until they can get it uprighted?
Keep the root ball wet. Most people are not aware of this. They think if a tree's toppled over, it's probably dead, and that's not the case in most situations. So what they can do is, number one, shade it. I saw people taking all kinds of things, everything from towels to bedspreads to jackets and everything else, and throwing them over these root balls. And secondly, keep it damp, because the tree has lost a lot of its root system. So it's going with just that little root ball. That's the only place it's going to be getting water from. And you can keep, depending on the tree species, them alive anywhere from 30 days to a year by just keeping that root ball wet.
Your book also mentions about planting trees close to sidewalks, buildings, that sort of thing. I was surprised when I read this about the fact that the more trees go down when they're close to buildings and sidewalks than out in the open. You would think that the building would kind of help it maybe reinforce the root system, but it's the opposite, correct?
Yes. Now, it depends on the type of tree. The roots of trees generally go out 3 times the diameter of the canopy. So if you have a big tree like a live oak, and that live oak is 50 feet across, then those roots are going to actually go out 150 feet in all directions from that tree. But if you have a palm tree, for example, that has a much smaller canopy, then it can go closer to buildings. I always recommend to people that they plant trees half of the mature width, that much distance away from a tree. For example, if you have a live oak that's going to be 50 feet wide, that you have it at least 25 feet from a building. Times when you cannot avoid that would be parking lots, possibly street plantings, where you really have to have trees closer to the concrete or else you're all going to bake. And in that situation, I think it's fine. You may just have to plan to upright them after the storm. What you want to be really, really careful of is not planting a tree somewhere where it is likely to take out a building.
You mentioned in your book about what's called hacking. This is an illegal cut of trees, I guess, that have been damaged in hurricanes. Tell us a little bit about that and why people should not cut trees like that.
What hat racking means is that you make a tree look like a hat rack. It's very fast and easy to do. You take a chainsaw and you take the major branches and you cut them all until they're 2 or 3 feet long. That's it. So what you end up with is a trunk and maybe these 5 little stubs coming up from where the trunk started branching out to the branches. The problem with that is that the tree thinks it's dying because it's lost so much of its canopy, and it immediately starts sending out new little tiny branches from the ends of these stubs. It will send out sometimes as many as 1,000 branches from each little stub. So what you end up with, as the tree starts to grow back, and a lot of them die along the way, but a lot of them do attempt to come back, they become like sails, very densely planted like the hedges we were talking about, and the next strong wind takes them down.
Okay, Pamela, you have 2 other books that you wrote before Stormscaping. One is called Easy Gardens for South Florida and The Best Garden Color for Florida. These are great books because it kind of gives you, if you're not used to gardening and you want to have a certain kind of plant in your yard, you can reference these books and it'll tell you what works and what doesn't based on the conditions around your house. These books are all on your website, easygardencolor.com, but this stormscaping book personally interests me because I track hurricanes, and that's the number one thing you see when there's damage from a hurricane is trees down. So if you wish to purchase these books, you can go to Amazon.com. Pamela, your book is about roughly 150 pages. It's got a lot of illustrations. What I like about it is the hurricane tracking maps, the historical maps you have. There's a lot of great maps in here from going back over the last century of hurricanes in South Florida and the state of Florida. Pamela, good luck in your book, and thank you very much for being with me.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.